My name is Carol, and I need to share with you the most painful story of my life. This is about loving someone deeply, about bringing a child into the world, and about watching helplessly as someone's refusal to accept reality destroyed that child's future. I tell this story not for sympathy, but because I hope it might prevent another family from experiencing the same tragedy. I met Stephen when I was 23 years old at a friend's barbecue in Austin, Texas. He was confident, funny, and had this infectious energy that drew people to him. Stephen worked as a construction supervisor and took great pride in being strong and capable. He was the kind of man who believed he could fix any problem with hard work and determination. We dated for 2 years before, getting married in a simple ceremony, surrounded by family and friends. Those early years of marriage were happy ones. Stephen was a devoted husband who worked hard to provide for us. We bought a small house in the suburbs, and I worked as an administrative assistant while we saved money and planned for the future we wanted to build together. We tried for several years to have children without success. The doctors ran tests and couldn't find any. Clear reason why I wasn't getting pregnant. We considered fertility treatments, but they were expensive and not guaranteed to work. Just when we were starting to accept that we might not be able to have biological children, I discovered I was pregnant at 29 years old. The pregnancy was difficult from the beginning. I had severe morning sickness that lasted well into my second trimester, and I developed gestational diabetes that required careful monitoring. But despite these challenges, Stephen and I were overjoyed. We were finally going to be parents, and nothing else mattered. Our son Jack was born in November after a long and complicated labor. He was small, weighing just 5 pounds and 8 ounces, but the doctors assured us he was healthy. Stephen held Jack with such tenderness and pride, promising our tiny son that he would always protect him and teach him everything he knew about being a man. The first few years of Jack's life seemed normal. He met his developmental milestones on schedule, learning to smile, to roll over, to sit up, but I noticed that Jack seemed more fragile than other babies. He would cry intensely when we moved him certain ways, and he seemed to bruise more easily than seemed normal. When Jack was about 18 months old, he fell while learning to walk and broke his arm. The break seemed disproportionate to the fall, which had been minor, and the emergency room doctor asked detailed questions about how it had happened. The doctor ordered additional tests, and that's when our lives changed forever. Jack was diagnosed with Osteogenesis imperfecta, a rare genetic disorder that affects the body's ability to produce collagen. In Jack's case, it meant that his bones were extremely fragile and would break easily from minor impacts that wouldn't hurt a typical child. The geneticist explained that this was a spontaneous mutation, not something either Stephen or I had passed down through our families. The diagnosis was devastating. The doctor explained that Jack would need to be extremely careful throughout his childhood and possibly his entire life. He would be at high risk for fractures, and each break could potentially cause permanent damage. There was no cure, only management and protection. I immediately began researching everything I could about osteogenesis imperfecta. I joined support groups, connected with other parents of children with the condition, and learned about adaptive equipment and safety measures we would need to implement. I was determined to give Jack the best possible life within the constraints of his condition, but Stephen reacted very differently to the diagnosis. He seemed to view it as a challenge to overcome rather than a reality to accept. He kept saying that Jack just needed to build stronger bones through exercise and good nutrition. He refused to believe that our son had a lifelong condition that would require permanent accommodations. I tried to explain to Stephen what the doctors had told us, that this was a genetic condition affecting how Jack's body produced collagen, and that no amount of exercise or vitamins would change that fundamental reality. But Stephen didn't want to hear it. He believed that accepting the diagnosis meant giving up on Jack, and he wasn't willing to do that. The disagreements about how to handle Jack's condition created tension in our marriage. I wanted to create a safe environment for Jack, to protect him from situations where he might get hurt. Stephen accused me of being overprotective, of treating Jack like he was made of glass, of preventing him from having a normal childhood. When Jack turned 3, Stephen started pushing for Jack to participate in activities that terrified me. He wanted Jack to play on playground equipment, to roughhouse with other children, to learn to ride a bicycle. Each of these activities carried serious risks for a child with Jack's condition. But Stephen couldn't or wouldn't see the danger. I tried to find compromises, ways that Jack could have normal childhood experiences while still being protected. We bought a special helmet and padding for Jack to wear during activities. We explained to Jack that he had special bones that needed extra care, We tried to balance safety with allowing Jack to explore and play, but Stephen resented the accommodations. He hated seeing Jack in protective gear, hated having to explain to other parents why Jack couldn't participate in certain activities. Stephen felt that Jack's condition reflected poorly on his masculinity somehow, as if having a fragile son meant Stephen himself was weak. The worst arguments happened when Jack would get hurt. Despite our best efforts to protect him, accidents happened. Jack would fall and break a bone, and we would rush him to the emergency room. These hospital visits were traumatic for all of us, but especially for Jack, who was too young to understand why his body betrayed him so often. After each incident, Stephen would blame me for being too cautious, saying that if we had just let Jack build up his strength through normal activities, he wouldn't be so fragile. This logic made no sense given what the doctors had told us, but Stephen clung to it. He needed to believe there was something we could do to fix Jack's condition. By the time Jack was 5 years old, he had already had 8 bone fractures. Each one was documented by the medical team, and we had to repeatedly explain to teachers, relatives, and sometimes even protective services that Jack had a diagnosed medical condition. The scrutiny was exhausting and humiliating, especially when Stephen's resistance to following medical advice made us look neglectful. Jack himself was adapting to his condition with remarkable resilience. He learned to move carefully, to avoid situations that might result in falls, to ask for help when he needed it. But I could see that he was also internalizing the tension between Stephen and me, feeling somehow responsible for our arguments. The incident that changed everything happened when Jack was 7 years old. It was a Saturday morning, and Jack was playing quietly in his room with action figures. Stephen came home from running errands and was frustrated about something that had happened at the hardware store. He walked into Jack's room and saw our son playing alone as usual. Stephen announced that Jack was going outside to play with the neighborhood kids. I immediately objected, reminding Stephen that Jack needed supervision and that the other children didn't always understand how careful they needed to be around him. But Stephen was in one of his moods where he had decided that I was being ridiculous and overprotective. He told Jack to put on his shoes and go outside. Jack looked at me with uncertainty, and I told Stephen that this wasn't a good idea, that Jack could play outside later when I could supervise. Stephen accused me of babying Jack, of preventing him from being a normal kid, of turning him into a mama's boy who would never learn to take care of himself. The argument escalated, with Stephen insisting that Jack needed to learn to navigate the world without me hovering over him constantly. He said that 7 years old was too old to need constant supervision, that other children Jack's age played outside unsupervised all the time. I tried to explain that Jack wasn't like other children, that his medical condition required additional precautions, but Stephen was done listening to me. He told Jack to go outside and play, and he told me to stop interfering. Jack looked between us, clearly uncomfortable with being the center of conflict, and slowly walked toward the door. I followed, intending to at least watch from the porch, but Stephen blocked my way and told me to let Jack have some independence. I stood at the window, watching anxiously as Jack joined a group of neighborhood children who were playing a game that involved running and tagging each other. Jack was trying to keep up, to be part of the group, but I could see he was moving too fast for safety. I called out to him to be careful, but he was too far away to hear me clearly. Within 10 minutes it happened. Jack was running, got his feet tangled, and fell hard onto the concrete driveway. The sound of his scream brought me running outside with Stephen close behind. Jack was lying on the ground, crying in agony, his right leg bent at an unnatural angle. We rushed Jack to the emergency room where x-rays confirmed what we already knew. His femur was broken, a severe fracture that would require surgery to repair. The orthopedic surgeon explained that breaks in children with osteogenesis imperfecta were serious and could lead to complications and permanent issues if not properly managed. Jack had to have a rod surgically inserted into his femur to stabilize the bone. He spent a week in the hospital in pain despite medication, frightened by the medical procedures and equipment. I stayed with him every night, holding his hand when he woke up crying, trying to comfort him and make sense of why this had happened. Stephen visited the hospital, but seemed unable to fully engage with what was happening. He would sit by Jack's bedside looking guilty and uncomfortable, then make excuses about needing to get back to work or run errands. The surgeon tried to impress upon Stephen the seriousness of Jack's condition and the importance of following medical advice, but Stephen just nodded without really listening. After Jack came home from the hospital, he had to use a wheelchair while his leg healed. This was devastating for a 7-year-old who had been working so hard to keep up with other children. Jack became quiet and withdrawn, spending hours watching other kids play outside while he was stuck inside recovering. I hoped that this incident would finally make Stephen understand the reality of Jack's condition. I thought that seeing Jack in so much pain, seeing the consequences of not taking proper precautions, would change how Stephen approached our son's care. But if anything, Stephen seemed to retreat further into denial. Stephen started working longer hours, coming home late and leaving early. When he was home, he avoided spending time with Jack, as if looking at our son reminded him of his own responsibility for what had happened. The guilt seemed to be eating at him, but instead of addressing it or changing his behavior, Stephen just pulled away from both Jack and me. The next few years were difficult. Jack recovered from the femur fracture, but his mobility was affected. He walked with a slight limp and was even more cautious about his movements than before. The confidence he had been building was shattered, replaced by fear and hesitation. I did my best to support Jack emotionally while managing his medical care. We continued regular appointments with his specialists, and I made sure Jack understood his condition in age-appropriate ways. I wanted him to be informed and empowered, not afraid, but it was a delicate balance. Stephen remained emotionally distant, engaging with Jack only superficially. He would ask about school or what Jack was watching on TV, but there was no real connection, no meaningful conversation. Jack noticed the change in his father and asked me several times why Daddy seemed sad or angry all the time. When Jack turned 11, Stephen suddenly decided he wanted to reconnect with our son. He announced that he was going to take Jack on special father-son outings to make up for lost time and to teach Jack the things a father should teach his son. Part of me was hopeful that Stephen was finally ready to accept Jack as he was and build a relationship within appropriate boundaries. But my hope was short-lived. Stephen's idea of appropriate activities for Jack showed that he still hadn't fully accepted his son's limitations. He wanted to take Jack hiking, fishing, camping, all activities that could be done safely with proper planning, but that Stephen wanted to approach without any accommodations for Jack's condition. The first outing was a local hiking trail that Stephen insisted would be easy and safe. I packed protective gear for Jack and reviewed, with both of them, the importance of staying on marked trails and avoiding steep or rocky areas. Stephen dismissed my concerns, saying I was being paranoid and that they would be fine. They returned home with Jack exhausted but happy. He talked excitedly about seeing wildlife and being outdoors with his dad. Stephen seemed proud and vindicated, pointing out that Jack had been fine and that my worrying had been unnecessary. I was relieved that nothing bad had happened, but I remained wary of Stephen's tendency to push boundaries. Over the next year, Stephen planned increasingly ambitious outings. He took Jack to a climbing gym with special adaptive equipment. They went to a batting cage where Jack could practice hitting baseballs in a controlled environment. They visited a ropes course designed for children with various abilities. Each activity was planned with some consideration for Jack's condition, and I allowed myself to believe that Stephen had finally found a way to connect with Jack while still keeping him safe. But then Stephen announced he wanted to take Jack deep sea fishing for Jack's 12th birthday. My immediate reaction was concern. Being on a boat in open water presented numerous risks for a child with osteogenesis. Imperfecta, the rocking motion of the boat, the slippery surfaces, the fishing equipment, all of it could lead to falls or injuries that would be catastrophic for Jack. I expressed my concerns to Stephen, suggesting alternative ways to celebrate Jack's birthday that would be just as special, but less risky. But Stephen had his heart set on this fishing trip. He said that this was something fathers did with their sons, a rite of passage that Jack deserved to experience. He accused me of always finding reasons to say no, of preventing Jack from having meaningful experiences with his father. Jack had overheard Stephen's proposal and was excited about the idea of deep sea fishing. He had never been on a boat before and was fascinated by the ocean and marine life. Seeing Jack's excitement made it harder for me to object, but my maternal instinct was screaming that this was dangerous. I tried to compromise by suggesting we all go together, so I could be there to help ensure Jack's safety. But Stephen refused, saying this needed to be a father-son experience, that my presence would undermine the whole purpose of the trip. He promised he would be extremely careful, that he understood the risks, and that he would never let anything happen to Jack. Against my better judgment, I agreed to let them go. Stephen booked a charter fishing boat for a half-day trip, scheduled for the Saturday after Jack's 12th birthday. Jack counted down the days with excitement, researching different types of fish they might catch and asking Stephen endless questions about fishing techniques. The morning of the trip, I helped Jack pack his bag with sunscreen, snacks, and the medication he needed to have with him at all times. I made Stephen promise multiple times that he would be vigilant about Jack's safety, that he wouldn't let Jack take any unnecessary risks. Stephen assured me that everything would be fine, and that I needed to trust him. I hugged Jack goodbye that morning, holding him perhaps a moment longer than necessary. He was so happy, so excited to have this special time with his father. I told him to be careful, to listen to Stephen, and to remember that it was okay to sit out any activity that felt unsafe. Jack promised he would be careful and rushed out to Stephen's truck. I spent that morning trying to distract myself from worry. I cleaned the house, ran errands, called my sister to talk. But every few minutes I would check my phone, hoping for a text from Stephen with an update. The charter was supposed to last 4 hours, and they should have been back by early afternoon. 2 o'clock came and went with no word from Stephen. I texted him asking how things were going but received no response. By 3 o'clock I was calling repeatedly, but Stephen's phone went straight to voicemail. I told myself that cell service was probably bad out on the water, that everything was fine, and they were just running late. At 4:30 my phone finally rang, but it wasn't Stephen calling. It was a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a woman identified herself as a paramedic calling from the dock where Stephen's charter boat had just returned. Jack had been injured and was being transported to the hospital. Stephen would meet me there. The drive to the hospital was the longest 20 minutes of my life. The paramedic hadn't given me details about Jack's injuries, just that he was conscious and stable, but needed immediate medical attention. My mind raced through worst-case scenarios, each one more terrifying than the last. I arrived at the emergency room to find Stephen pacing in the waiting area, soaking wet and looking devastated. When he saw me, he started to cry, something I had rarely seen him do in all our years of marriage. He tried to explain what had happened, his words tumbling out in a confused rush. They had been out on the boat for about 2 hours when Jack caught a fish. It wasn't a big fish, but it was Jack's first catch, and he was so excited. Jack was reeling it in with Stephen's help when the boat hit a larger wave than they had been experiencing. The sudden motion caused Jack to lose his balance. Stephen had been standing right next to Jack, ready to help, but the wave had caught them both off guard. Jack stumbled backward and fell, hitting his back against the edge of the boat's bench before sliding down to the deck. Stephen immediately went to help Jack up, but Jack screamed in pain when Stephen tried to move him. Jack said he couldn't feel his legs. Stephen laid him down gently and called for the boat captain, who immediately radioed for the Coast Guard and turned the boat back toward shore. They kept Jack as still and comfortable as possible during the 40-minute trip back to the dock, where paramedics were waiting. As Stephen finished telling me this, a doctor emerged from the treatment area and asked to speak with us. We followed him to a private consultation room, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. The doctor's face was grave as he explained that Jack had suffered a severe spinal injury. The impact against the boat bench had caused a compression fracture of one of Jack's vertebrae because of Jack's osteogenesis imperfecta. The fracture was more severe than it would have been in a typical child. Fragments of bone had damaged Jack's spinal cord. They had done emergency imaging and consulted with neurosurgeons. The doctor's next words changed our lives forever. Jack had sustained a spinal cord injury that would likely result in permanent paralysis from the waist down, while there was a small chance of some recovery of sensation or movement with time and intensive therapy. The doctors believed it was unlikely that Jack would ever walk again. I heard the words, but they didn't seem real. My 12-year-old son, who had already dealt with so much because of his condition, was now paralyzed. The child who had worked so hard to stay mobile despite his fragile bones would now need a wheelchair, not because of his osteogenesis, Imperfecta, but because of a preventable accident that never should have happened. Stephen collapsed into a chair, his face in his hands, sobbing. The doctor gave us a few moments before explaining that Jack was being admitted to the hospital and would need surgery to stabilize his spine. After that, there would be a long recovery process and eventually rehabilitation to help Jack adapt to life with paralysis. I asked if I could see Jack, and the doctor led me to his room. My son was lying in a hospital bed, pale and frightened, with a cervical collar around his neck to keep him immobilized. When he saw me, he started to cry. He said he was sorry, that he had tried to be careful, that he didn't mean to fall. My heart broke into a million pieces. My child was apologizing to me for being injured, as if this was somehow his fault. I held his hand carefully, avoiding the IV lines, and told him that none of this was his fault, that accidents happen, and that we would get through this together. But inside, I was screaming with rage and grief and guilt. The surgery to stabilize Jack's spine was scheduled for the next morning. The neurosurgeon explained that they needed to remove bone, fragments, and decompress the spinal cord, then use rods and screws to stabilize the vertebrae because of Jack's osteogenesis imperfecta. The surgery was more complex and carried additional risks, but it was necessary to prevent further damage. That night, I stayed by Jack's bedside while he drifted in and out of sleep, medicated for pain but still uncomfortable and frightened. Stephen sat in the corner of the room, not speaking, barely moving. The weight of what had happened hung in the air between us, too enormous to address while Jack was awake and listening. The surgery took 6 hours. Stephen and I sat in the surgical waiting room, surrounded by other families facing their own medical crises, but feeling completely alone. We didn't talk to each other. There was nothing to say that wouldn't lead to the explosion of anger and blame that was building inside me. The surgeon came out to tell us the surgery had gone as well as could be expected. Jack's spine was now stabilized, and they had done everything possible to minimize further damage to the spinal cord. But the prognosis remained the same. Jack would most likely be permanently paralyzed from the waist down. The weeks that followed were a blur of medical procedures, consultations with specialists, and beginning the long process of accepting our new reality. Jack had to lie flat for 2 weeks while his spine began to heal. Then came the gradual process of sitting up, adjusting to the fact that he couldn't feel or move his legs. Jack cried often during those early days, asking when the feeling would come back, when he would be able to walk again. The doctors had explained that there was a small possibility of some recovery, but they didn't want to give false hope. I had to find a way to be honest with Jack about his condition, while still giving him reasons to hope and work toward the best possible outcome. Stephen fell into a deep depression after Jack's accident. He stopped going to work, stopped eating properly, stopped engaging with life. He would sit for hours staring at nothing, trapped in his own guilt and grief. When I tried to talk to him about what had happened, he would either shut down completely or lash out in anger. The worst part was that Stephen stopped visiting Jack in the hospital. He would make excuses about not feeling well or needing to take care of things at home. But the truth was he couldn't face our son. Jack would ask when Daddy was coming to visit, and I had to make up explanations. That wouldn't hurt his feelings or make him feel responsible for Stephen's absence. After 3 weeks in the hospital, Jack was transferred to a rehabilitation facility that specialized in pediatric spinal cord injuries. This is where he would spend the next 3 months learning to navigate the world as a wheelchair user. The facility was wonderful, with caring staff and other children dealing with similar challenges. But it broke my heart to see my 12-year-old son having to learn these skills. I was there every day, attending therapy sessions with Jack, learning alongside him about transfers, pressure sores, bladder and bowel management, and all the other aspects of life with paralysis. Jack worked so hard, never complaining even when he was exhausted or discouraged. He made friends with other kids at the facility and started to adapt to his new reality with a resilience that amazed me. Stephen visited the rehab facility only twice during those 3 months. Both visits were brief and uncomfortable, with Stephen barely able to look at Jack, let alone have meaningful conversations with him. Jack's questions about when Daddy would visit again became less frequent as he realized his father was choosing not to be present. The therapists at the facility strongly encouraged family counseling to help us all process what had happened and learn to function as a changed family unit. I participated eagerly, desperate for any help in navigating this new reality. But Stephen refused to attend, saying he wasn't ready to talk about it yet. The financial burden of Jack's care was overwhelming. Despite having insurance, the out-of-pocket costs for his surgery, hospital stay, and rehabilitation were enormous. Our house needed to be modified to be wheelchair accessible, and Jack needed specialized equipment and ongoing therapy. Stephen had stopped working after the accident, so we were down to just my income, which wasn't nearly enough. I had to return to work while Jack was still in rehab, leaving him during the day for the first time since his accident. It felt like abandonment, even though I knew he was in good hands and that I had no choice. If we were going to keep a roof over our heads, Jack said he understood, but I could see the fear in his eyes when I left each day. When Jack finally came home after 3 months of rehabilitation, our house had been modified with ramps, widened doorways, and an accessible bathroom. Jack's bedroom was now on the ground floor where our home office had been. Everything was different, and yet we were supposed to somehow create a new normal, Stephen was still in the house but barely functioning. He had lost significant weight, rarely showered or changed clothes, and spent most of his time in the garage or bedroom, avoiding both Jack and me. I was managing Jack's care, working full-time, handling all the household responsibilities, and carrying the weight of the trauma we had all experienced. Jack tried to stay positive, but I could see him struggling with depression and anxiety. He was back to remote schooling temporarily, while we figured out how to manage his return to regular classes. His friends from before the accident were supportive, but didn't know how to relate to him anymore. Jack was isolated and lonely, dealing with physical, emotional, and social challenges that no child should have to face. About 6 months after the accident, I finally confronted Stephen about his complete withdrawal from our family. I told him that I understood he felt guilty about what had happened, that we all wished we could go back and make different choices, but that Jack needed his father and I needed my husband. Stephen's response was devastating. He said he couldn't forgive himself for what he had done to Jack. He said that every time he looked at our son, he saw the life Jack should have had but would never have, because of his stubbornness and refusal to accept Jack's limitations. He said he had destroyed Jack's future, and he couldn't live with that knowledge. I tried to help Stephen see that Jack still had a future, that many people with spinal cord injuries lived full and meaningful lives, that we could help Jack adapt and thrive despite his paralysis. But Stephen had given up. He saw Jack's condition as his personal failure, and he couldn't move past that perspective. The situation became untenable. Stephen's depression was so severe that he needed professional help, but he refused to seek it. Jack was suffering from his father's rejection on top of everything else he was dealing with. I was drowning trying to hold everyone together while processing my own grief and anger. Eventually, Stephen moved out. He said he couldn't be in the house anymore, couldn't keep facing the daily reminder of what he had done. He moved in with his brother temporarily and promised he would get help and work on being able to have a relationship with Jack, but months passed with no real progress. Jack stopped asking about Stephen after a while. He seemed to accept that his father couldn't handle being around him anymore. This acceptance was perhaps the most heartbreaking thing of all, watching my son resign himself to being abandoned by his father, at the time when he needed family support most. Today, Jack is 16 years old. He uses a wheelchair full-time and has adapted remarkably well to his limitations. He returned to regular school, made new friends who see him for who he is rather than defining him by his disability, and is making plans for his future. He wants to study computer science in college, and has already taught himself programming languages. But Jack and Stephen have virtually no relationship. Stephen sends birthday cards and occasionally texts, but he hasn't visited in over 2 years. The guilt and shame have consumed him to the point where he has essentially chosen to have no son rather than face what happened. I have worked through my own anger at Stephen over the years, with the help of therapy and the necessity of focusing on Jack's needs. Do I wish Stephen had listened to me all those years ago when I tried to explain Jack's limitations? Absolutely. Do I hold him responsible for the accident that paralyzed our son? Yes, though I also recognize that it was an accident, not intentional harm. But what I cannot forgive is Stephen's choice to abandon Jack emotionally after the accident. Jack didn't choose to have osteogenesis imperfecta. He didn't choose to be paralyzed. He's an innocent child who has faced more challenges than most people face in a lifetime, and he deserved to have both parents supporting him through this. I share this story because I want other parents of children with special needs to understand how critical it is to accept and accommodate your child's reality. Denial doesn't protect your child. It doesn't make their condition go away. It only creates dangerous situations where preventable tragedies can occur. If your child has physical limitations, those limitations must be respected and accommodated. It's not about being overprotective or preventing your child from having a normal childhood. It's about keeping your child safe while still allowing them to experience life within appropriate boundaries. Stephen's refusal to fully accept Jack's osteogenesis imperfecta stemmed from his own issues about masculinity and strength. He couldn't accept having a son who was fragile and needed special care. That inability to accept reality led directly to decisions that permanently disabled our child. I also want parents to know that if tragedy does occur, your child needs you more than ever. Stephen's guilt and shame, while understandable, led him to abandon Jack when Jack needed his father most. No matter how responsible you feel for your child's injury or condition, withdrawing from them is the worst possible choice. Jack and I have built a good life together despite everything we've been through. We have learned to navigate his medical needs, his accessibility requirements, and the emotional challenges of his situation. He is an incredible young man with a bright future ahead of him, and I am proud of his resilience and strength. But there will always be a father-shaped hole in Jack's life, and that breaks my heart. Stephen chose guilt and avoidance over being present for his son. That choice has hurt Jack in ways that may never fully heal, regardless of how well he adapts to everything else. If you are a parent dealing with a child's medical condition or disability, please get help if you need it. Talk to a therapist, join support groups, do whatever it takes to process your feelings so you can show up for your child. Your child didn't ask for their condition, but they are asking for your love and support through it.